The X-Men are one of the biggest franchises in all of comics. They've spawned billions of dollars in movies, TV shows, video games, and merchandise. But the original comic, it basically flopped. Today I'm breaking down the entire history of the X-Men, from their embarrassing debut to the modern era, and trust me, it gets weird fast. The Silver Age Originals. In September 1963, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby dropped the X-Men #1 on the world, and the world responded with a resounding, "Hey!" Here's the thing. Lee originally wanted to call the book The Merry Mutants. Editorial said no, slapped X-Men on it instead, and accidentally created one of the most recognizable brand names in entertainment history. The original lineup was 5 teenagers under Professor Xavier: Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Angel, Beast, and Iceman. Magneto showed up in that very first issue too, because apparently you launch a franchise by introducing your hero and your villain on page 1. Now, the concept was genuinely ambitious. This was 1963. The civil rights movement was in full swing, and Lee and Kirby built a comic entirely around prejudice and whether humanity could accept people born different. Xavier was peaceful coexistence. Magneto was the response when that dream got punched in the face. But despite all that thematic weight, nobody cared. Sales declined through the late 60s. And by 1970, the book was reprints only. Basically canceled, the franchise that would eventually dominate Marvel couldn't keep the lights on for 7 years. But if you think the story ends there, you clearly haven't met the team that saved it. Giant size and the all-new, all-different era. By 1975, the X-Men were dead, not in a cool comic book way, where they come back with a new costume and a vendetta. Dead as in the series had been reduced to publishing reprints because nobody was buying it. Marvel's mutant team was a failed experiment collecting dust on the shelf. Then, one single issue changed everything. Giant-size X-Men #1 dropped in May 1975, written by Len Wein with art by Dave Cockrum, and it basically performed a resurrection on the entire franchise. The concept was called Second Genesis, and the setup was simple. Professor X needs to rescue the original X-Men from a living mutant island called Krakoa. So he does what any reasonable bald telepath would do, and recruits an entirely new international team of strangers to go handle it. This one issue introduced Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Thunderbird. Wolverine, who'd shown up fighting the Hulk the year before in Incredible Hulk #181, officially joined the roster here too. 4 of those 5 characters became some of the most iconic superheroes in comic book history. Thunderbird got killed off almost immediately. Welcome to the team, John. Hope you enjoyed your stay, because it lasted about 12 minutes. But here's the thing. That phrase, all new, all different, was literally coined in this issue, and Marvel is still using it in their marketing nearly 50 years later. One comic turned a failed book about teenagers into a superhero empire. Not bad for a one-shot, but if you think a new roster was dramatic, wait until you hear what they did to Jean Grey. The Dark Phoenix Saga. Here's the thing about the Dark Phoenix Saga. It's one of the most iconic stories in comic book history, and the ending that made it legendary wasn't even the ending the creators wanted. Let me explain. Jean Grey had already gone through the original Phoenix Saga across Uncanny X-Men 101 through 108, where she was exposed to fatal radiation and emerged as something cosmic, which is, you know, not ideal when you're trying to keep a low profile. But the real story kicked off in Uncanny X-Men 129, running through issue 138. Chris Claremont and John Byrne built a slow corruption arc where the Hellfire Club's mastermind used psychic illusions to seduce Jean, awakening something dark inside her. This wasn't your standard hero turns evil plot. Mastermind was literally rewriting her psychology, unlocking desires she'd buried her entire life, and then Jean snapped. Dark Phoenix consumed an entire star, destroying an alien planet and killing 5 billion inhabitants. Just casually committed genocide on a Tuesday. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Claremont and Byrne originally planned for Jean to survive. Depowered, imprisoned, something manageable. But editor-in-chief Jim Shooter said absolutely not. You don't wipe out 5 billion people and walk away with a slap on the wrist. So he forced a rewrite, and Jean Grey killed herself by activating a Shi'ar death ray to stop the Phoenix from ever hurting anyone again. The creators were furious, and the ending became the single most important superhero death in comics history. All because an editor said, no, that's too far. But if you think one woman's cosmic breakdown was intense, wait until the X-Men have to deal with the literal apocalypse, except it hasn't happened yet. Days of Future Past. Claremont and Byrne looked at everything they'd built with the Dark Phoenix saga and said, cool, now let's break the entire timeline. And they did it in 2 issues. 2. Uncanny X-Men 141 and 142, published across 1980 and 1981, contain an entire dystopian epic that modern comics would stretch across 12 issues and somehow say less. The premise is beautifully simple. In a future set in 2013, Sentinels have conquered the United States. Mutants are hunted, killed, or thrown into internment camps. The few survivors are broken. An adult Kate Pryde sends her consciousness back in time into her younger self, Kitty, to prevent the event that triggers all of it, the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly by Mystique's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. The X-Men stop the assassination. Crisis averted, except here's the thing. The story never confirms the future was actually prevented. The ending is deliberately ambiguous. The X-Men save the Senator, sure, but whether that erased the dystopia or just delayed it, nobody knows. Not the characters, not the readers, nobody. And that uncertainty became the entire franchise's DNA. Time travel, alternate timelines, futures that might still be coming. Every major X-Men story that plays with those concepts traces directly back to these 2 issues. The 2014 film adaptation basically exists because of them. 2 issues. That's all it took to reshape 40 years of storytelling, which is almost wholesome compared to what comes next, because the Mutant Massacre didn't just reshape the X-Men, it destroyed them. The Mutant Massacre. Up until 1986, the X-Men dealt with cosmic forces, dystopian futures, and psychic warfare. But the Mutant Massacre was different. This time, the horror wasn't some abstract threat from space. It was happening right now, underground, in the sewers of Manhattan. The Marauders, a kill squad assembled by Mr. Sinister, descended into the Morlock tunnels and started slaughtering everyone they could find. The Morlocks were mutants too deformed or too outcast to live on the surface, just trying to survive. Hundreds of them were butchered, not in some grand battle, just a massacre, which is, not ideal. The X-Men rushed in to help and got torn apart for it, but the real gut punch was Angel. Warren Worthington, one of the original 5 X-Men, had his wings destroyed beyond repair. The trauma spiraled him into such darkness that Apocalypse scooped him up and rebuilt him as Archangel, Horseman of Death. One of the X-Men's first heroes turned into a weapon for one of their greatest enemies. Cool. Add that to the list. Here's the thing nobody talks about though. The Mutant Massacre was a surprise sales hit. It spanned Uncanny X-Men, X-Factor, New Mutants, Thor, Power Pack, and Daredevil. And Marvel looked at those numbers and said we should do this every year. The modern crossover event template was essentially born right here in those bloody Morlock tunnels. But if you think the crossover era peaked in the 80s, wait until you see what happened when Jim Lee got his hands on the 90s. The 90s, blue and gold, boom. In October 1991, Chris Claremont and Jim Lee released X-Men Volume 2, Issue 1, and it sold 8.1 million copies. That's the best-selling single comic book of all time. It still holds the Guinness World Record over 30 years later, and nobody is ever touching that number. Ever. Now here's the thing. A huge chunk of those sales came from the speculator boom. Marvel published the issue with 4 variant covers simultaneously, and retailers lost their minds ordering copies they had zero chance of actually selling. People were buying 5-6 copies at a time, sealing them in plastic, and stashing them in closets like they were investing in mutual funds. Most of those 8.1 million copies have never been read. They're sitting in someone's garage right now between a broken exercise bike and a box of VHS tapes. But underneath all that speculator nonsense, something genuinely great was happening. The X-Men split into 2 squads. Cyclops led the blue team with Wolverine, Beast, Psylocke, Rogue, and Gambit. Storm led the gold team with Jean Grey, Colossus, Iceman, and Archangel. Every fan immediately picked a side and started arguments that are still going today, and Jim Lee's character redesigns became the look for the X-Men. Not one of the looks, the look. When the 1992 animated series launched, it pulled directly from Lee's art, and an entire generation grew up thinking that's just what the X-Men were supposed to look like, which, honestly, is not wrong. But if you think the 90s were all record sales and cool jackets, wait until Marvel decided to erase the entire timeline. Age of Apocalypse. In 1995, Marvel did something so insane it honestly shouldn't have worked. They killed Professor X, not in a dramatic present-day storyline, not in a fake-out cliffhanger. They killed him in the past. And then they replaced every single X-Men title on the shelves with something completely different. Here's what happened. Xavier's son Legion, a powerful but deeply unstable mutant, decided the best way to help his father's dream was to travel back in time and kill Magneto before he ever became a threat. Noble idea, terrible execution, because Legion accidentally murdered Xavier instead, his own father, which is, not ideal. Without Xavier, Apocalypse launched his conquest of Earth a full decade early, and since nobody was around to stop him, he won. The entire planet fell under his rule, and reality as readers knew it just stopped existing. But here's the truly wild part. Marvel didn't just tell this story in one book. They temporarily canceled every ongoing X-Men series and replaced them with 8 interlocking miniseries set in this new dystopian timeline. Every title gone, replaced. That's like a restaurant throwing out their entire menu and saying we serve different food. Now, trust us. Eventually, Bishop, the one mutant who remembered the original timeline, was sent back to prevent Xavier's death. Reality snapped back to normal. The whole event got retroactively designated as Earth 295, a parallel universe that technically still exists somewhere. 30 years later, Age of Apocalypse remains one of the most celebrated X-Men events ever published. It proved the franchise could survive literally anything, including killing its own founder. But if you think replacing a few comic titles was a bold move, wait until you hear what Grant Morrison did to the X-Men when he got his hands on them. New X-Men, the Morrison era. In 2001, Marvel handed the X-Men to Grant Morrison, and he immediately set the entire franchise on fire. Not metaphorically. His very first arc, E is for Extinction, opened with a Sentinel army wiping out Genosha and killing millions of mutants in a single issue. That's not a slow build. That's a statement of intent. Nothing is sacred, and we're only on page 1. Morrison rebranded the book as New X-Men and spent 40 issues systematically reinventing every concept the franchise had built over 4 decades. He introduced secondary mutations as a biological phenomenon. Beast transformed into a full lion-like creature. Emma Frost developed an entirely new diamond body form on top of her telepathy. These weren't random power-ups. Morrison framed them as the next stage of mutant evolution, and that idea quietly rewired X-Men biology forever. Then there were the new characters, the Stepford Cuckoos, Fantomex, Cassandra Nova, who was literally Xavier's evil twin that he strangled in the womb. Cool, that's also a thing that happened. And Zorn, a mysterious healer who turned out to be Magneto in disguise, which either blew your mind or made you throw the comic across the room, depending on who you ask. Xavier publicly outed himself as a mutant. The school became an actual campus. Morrison treated the X-Men less like superheroes and more like a counterculture movement, which was either brilliant reinvention or reckless deconstruction. Zero middle ground. But here's the thing nobody argues about. The book was dying before Morrison showed up, and he saved it. If you think that level of creative chaos sounds intense, wait until you hear what happened when Marvel decided to undo most of it overnight. House of M and decimation. 3 words. That's all it took to nearly wipe out an entire species. On November 2nd, 2005, a date Marvel fans now call M-Day, the Scarlet Witch rewrote reality with a single sentence: no more mutants. And just like that, the global mutant population went from somewhere between 14 and 30 million to fewer than 200, which is, not ideal. The Decimation crossover kicked off formally with a one-shot written by Chris Claremont on November 9th, 2005, and the fallout bled into X-Men, New X-Men, Excalibur, X-Factor Investigations, basically every mutant book on the shelf. Characters woke up powerless. Identities that had defined them for decades were just gone. Imagine being able to shoot lasers from your eyes your whole life, and then one morning you're just some guy named Scott with bad vision. But here's where it gets interesting. Marvel's editor-in-chief Joe Quesada straight up admitted that the event was designed to trim the roster. After 40 years of publishing, the number of mutant characters had, in his words, gotten out of hand. So so they culled them. Millions down to 198. That's not subtext. That's an editorial team looking at a spreadsheet and going, yeah, this is too many. And honestly, it kinda worked. Reducing mutants to a handful of survivors forced the X-Men back into their original role as hated, feared outsiders. The core metaphor of prejudice that had been slowly diluted by sheer population growth suddenly had teeth again. When there are 30 million of you, persecution feels abstract. When there are 198, it feels existential. But if you think losing your powers is bad, wait until the Phoenix Force comes back and the Avengers decide it's their problem too. Avengers versus X-Men. Marvel assembled the biggest writer's room in comics history for this one. Bendis, Aaron, Brubaker, Hickman, and Fraction, all working on a single 12-issue event launching in April 2012. The premise was simple. The Phoenix Force was heading back to Earth, and nobody could agree on what to do about it. The X-Men, still reeling from decimation, saw the Phoenix as salvation, a cosmic force that could reignite the mutant gene and undo everything Wanda Maximoff had broken. Hope Summers was the assumed host. To Cyclops, this was the answer to years of extinction-level fear. To Captain America and the Avengers, it was a planet-killing threat that needed to be stopped immediately. So Marvel's two biggest factions went to war, full-scale superhero warfare. And for most of the event, you could genuinely argue both sides had a point. The Avengers weren't wrong about the Phoenix's destructive history. The X-Men weren't wrong about needing a miracle. But here's where it gets dark. Cyclops eventually absorbed the full Phoenix Force. All of it. The same thing that destroyed Jean Grey, the same thing that consumed a star and killed billions, now lived inside the guy who'd spent his entire life being the responsible one. And in that state, he murdered Professor Xavier, his mentor, his surrogate father. One kill. That's all it took to redefine a character who'd been a hero since 1963. And the worst part? He was right about the Phoenix restoring mutant kind. It actually worked. He just had to kill his father figure to get there. That moral ambiguity would follow Cyclops for years, pushing him into territory no one expected from Marvel's Boy Scout. But if you think that identity crisis was complicated, wait until you see what Jonathan Hickman did to the entire mutant species. The Krakoan Age. In 2019, Jonathan Hickman did something nobody had ever done before. He took control of the entire X-Men editorial line as both writer and creative director, and then he burned the franchise to the ground and rebuilt it from scratch. House of X and Powers of X didn't just shake up the status quo, they replaced it entirely. Here's the setup. Professor X and Magneto, two guys who have been trying to kill each other for decades, team up with Emma Frost to build a mutant nation on the living island of Krakoa, and the invitation wasn't selective. Every mutant on the planet was welcome. Heroes, villains, war criminals, that guy who can turn his skin into rubber. Everybody. Apocalypse is your neighbor now. Deal with it. But the real game changer was the Resurrection Protocols. A group of 5 mutants called, creatively, the Five, could combine their powers to bring any dead mutant back to life using mind backups stored in Cerebro. Death literally stopped mattering, which is, you know, a pretty significant shift for a franchise built on dramatic sacrifice. And then Hickman pulled the rug out from under everything. The entire Krakoan project was gradually revealed to be based on Moira McTaggart's 9 previous lives across alternate timelines. She had lived through the future. She knew how every version of mutant kind ended, and it was always badly. Krakoa wasn't a utopia. It was a last desperate attempt to break a cycle that had never been broken before. The Krakoan Age ran from 2019 to 2024, spawning dozens of interconnected titles and fundamentally rewriting what X-Men comics could be. A nation built on hope, designed by someone who had already watched hope fail 9 times. But every paradise has an expiration date, and when Krakoa fell, the X-Men had to figure out what comes next. From the ashes. Here's the thing about the X-Men. You can dismantle their island. You can depower 90% of their species. You can kill Professor X, corrupt Jean Grey, rewrite reality, and scatter them across a dozen fractured timelines. And they'll just come back every single time. In 2024, Marvel pulled the plug on Krakoa. The mutant nation was gone. The resurrection protocols were gone. And suddenly, mutants were right back where they started. Hated, feared, and very much mortal. 3 new flagship titles launched to carry the era forward. X-Men by Jed MacKay and Ryan Stegman. Uncanny X-Men by Gail Simone and David Marquez. Exceptional X-Men by Eve L. Ewing and Carmen Carnero. 3 books, 3 creative teams, 1 very familiar premise. Mutants are outsiders again. Good luck. But here's where it gets poetic. The relaunch was called From the Ashes, a name pulled directly from the opening text of Giant Size X-Men #1 back in 1975, the exact issue that saved the franchise the first time. That's not a coincidence. That's a mission statement. And to make sure nobody could just undo death with a phone call to the Five anymore, Marvel introduced Resurrection-Linked Degenerative Sickness, a condition caused by repeated use of Krakoan resurrection. Basically, coming back from the dead too many times will now kill you, which is, not ideal. So the X-Men are back to being a handful of scared, powerful people in a world that wants them gone. The same metaphor Stan Lee built in 1963, the same tension Chris Claremont perfected in the 80s, the same story that's been told and retold for over 60 years now, because it never stops being relevant. The franchise has already moved forward again with X-Men: Shadows of Tomorrow, following the Age of Revelation event in late 2025, because the X-Men don't end, they just reinvent. That's not a mutation, that's a superpower. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.